Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world, one book at a time. So today, we're diving into Ilan Pappé's book, The Biggest Prison on Earth. Now, his central argument is pretty provocative. He says that the governance of the West Bank and Gaza since 1967 was never meant to be a temporary occupation. Instead, it was a pre-configured system of control designed from the outset. And what's really fascinating is where Pappé begins his analysis. It's not in 1967, which is what you'd expect. No, he takes us back 4 years earlier, to 1963. He points to documented planning that suggests the system that followed wasn't just a spontaneous reaction to war, but something that was actually designed in advance. And the level of detail in this planning is pretty striking. We're talking about a plan with a code name, the Shotham Plan. Legal and military teams had already mapped out an entire administrative structure. They divided the West Bank into districts, appointed key personnel, and even gathered intelligence files. So the idea here is that this was an administrative model basically sitting on a shelf, just ready to be implemented when the moment arrived. Okay, so if this was a pre-planned architecture of control, what did that architecture actually look like on the ground? Well, the book breaks it down into several key legal and bureaucratic tools that really formed the foundation of the whole system. The first, and maybe the most powerful tool, was the military order. Think about it like this. These decrees allowed the military to create any law it wanted. One Israeli military lawyer from that time even said, "In practice, we could legislate any law we wanted." It essentially merged legislative, executive, and judicial power all into one single authority. And then, layered right on top of that were the emergency regulations. This was some old legal hardware, a holdover from the British Mandate. This framework provided what the book describes as absolute dictatorial powers, and it was a tool that allowed for the simple withholding of basic human rights in order to manage the population and, to quell any resistance. Now let's talk about land, because this is where the bureaucratic side gets really interesting. The book lays out this 3-step process. First, land was seized for urgent military needs. Then, and this is the clever part, they would use interpretations of very old Ottoman law to reclassify that private land as state land. And once it was state land, well then, it could be transferred for building civilian settlements. The scale of this was staggering. By 1985, this method had been used to take over nearly 40% of the West Bank. Now, according to Pappé, this whole system wasn't static. It actually operated in 2 main modes, you could say, but, and this is absolutely crucial, he argues they weren't different systems. They were just shifts in the intensity of the very same underlying architecture. So the critical point here is the cycle. You have the open-air model. Now, it allowed for some measure of autonomous life, but it was still a pressure cooker, oppressive enough that it would inevitably generate resistance. And when that resistance flared up, the system would shift gears into the much harsher maximum security model as a form of retaliation, before eventually cycling back. This pattern just kept repeating itself over the decades. Okay, so that brings us to the 1990s and the Oslo Accords. Now, most of us probably think of Oslo as a peace process, but this book analyzes it very differently. It's seen as a structural reconfiguration of the very system we've been talking about, basically a system upgrade. Yeah, this quote from the book really captures the core of Pappé's argument. He's not just saying that the Accords failed to bring peace, he's contending that they actually solidified Israeli control in a new way, fragmenting Palestinian territory, and for many people, making daily life even more difficult than before. And the main mechanism for this was the division of the West Bank into these now infamous areas, A, B, and C. On paper, the Palestinian Authority got full civil and security control over Area A, but Area A amounted to just 18% of the territory. This chart gives you a pretty stark visual of that. You see, while zones of limited Palestinian autonomy were created, the agreement left 60% of the West Bank, Area C, where most of the land and resources are, under full Israeli control. This is what created what many commentators started calling a Swiss cheese geography of disconnected Palestinian islands. So this all leads to a huge question. Why has this system, in all its different forms, lasted for more than half a century? Well, the book argues it's because it has an architecture that was designed for permanence. According to Pappé, it's really a combination of things. You have the physical factor, the settlements creating irreversible facts on the ground. Then there's the bureaucracy itself, which has grown into this self-perpetuating living organism. There's the narrative, the security framing that's used to justify all the control measures. And finally, the demographic strategy, this idea of insistation, which is essentially a strategy to contain and isolate Palestinian communities. And this right here gets us to the absolute heart of the book's thesis. The language we use, it matters a lot. By calling a permanent, deeply embedded administrative system a temporary occupation, you obscure its true nature. And that, Pappé argues, is the ultimate crisis in perception. So when you start to analyze the institutional architecture, the laws, the bureaucracy, the spatial planning, you get a fundamentally different perspective. It shifts the focus away from asking who's to blame for any single crisis and toward understanding how the underlying system itself is designed to produce these outcomes over and over again. This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind crisis and perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon. And for a shorter visual overview of this topic, you can check out the mini explainer linked in the description. If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please do like, subscribe, and maybe comment with some books or topics you'd like us to explore next.